Before we get started on today's episode, a word of caution. In today's show, we'll be diving into topics that include mental health struggles. While we strive to approach these issues thoughtfully and provide valuable insights, it's important to note that we are, of course, not mental health professionals. So this content should not serve as any kind of substitute for qualified medical advice. And if you or someone you know is dealing with mental health issues, we urge you to seek professional help immediately. National helplines and resources are available, and immediate intervention is critical for effectively coping and managing these kinds of concerns. With that, on with the show.
Growth is oxygen for startups. Sooner or later, you'll want to do Google Ads, Instagram, display, TikTok, SEO, what have you. Newsflash, you will not do these well on your own. That's where Insil comes in. There are a lot of agencies out there, but not many of them are rated 4.8 stars on Google. Do growth right. Go to insil.com.au to get in touch and tell them we sent you. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor, hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com to get that 20% off.
I think founders need to think about investing in themselves in the same way that they would invest in their startup. And if it helps you to think about it this way, you are the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. You are at least as important as the capital, as the features of your product, as your go-to-market strategy. You are at least as important as those other resources and facets of your business. And so while you're spending endless amount of energy and time working on those things, you as the pivotal resource for your startup deserve that kind of investment as well. You're listening to the Startup Podcast, a show focused on helping you build, run, and invest in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're an investor, founder, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights on the principles that power high-growth disruption the way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv.
And I'm Chris.
Hi, I'm Georgia.
And in today's episode, it's the second in the series that we've devoted to founder mental health. In the previous episode of the series, we had a founder, Mike Filbey, share his raw and personal story about mental health and burnout. Today, we're talking to a coach who helps founders deal with the many challenges they encounter, most especially around mindset and mental health. Georgia Dienst has had an incredibly varied and successful career across business development, venture capital, and technology, including at X, Google's famous moonshot factory. More recently, Georgia has focused on coaching other founders and executives, both privately and as a coach in residence at the Machari Method, the method pioneered by entrepreneur-turned-coach Matt Machari. She's kindly agreed to share some of her wisdom with us here at the Startup Podcast. Georgia, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, before we started recording, we talked a bit about the fact that you've had personal experience with burnout as a high-performing professional. So maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, gosh, where to start? I mean, I think the journey into a burnout or a mental health crisis starts often much earlier than when we have the signs, so to speak. And I would say that for me, I had a relatively good childhood, and yet there was obviously a lot of bumps throughout the childhood trauma in a way. And I just realized that I came out of the start in my 20s and had a huge amount of ambition and ridiculous amounts of pressure on myself to perform and to do things that were very grand and where I would garner a vast amount of acknowledgement by people that were watching me, whatever that meant. That pressure, I think, was with me. And I think during my 20s, your body is so able to compensate for many, many, many things and many late nights and maybe too much alcohol and too much coffee. And I think my 20s were spent in startups, and it was this fantastic ride. It was exciting. It was exhilarating. Many late nights, which were great because I think, especially in your 20s, the community aspect of being in a startup and that total melting of boundaries of like who's a boss and who's a friend, and we all just in it together. And I think there's something that feels like a family nearly, and it feels so incredibly just powerful and sort of like being in love with somebody, but you're in love with this whole thing, and therefore these boundaries just there are none. It's just one free fall. And I think The upside was the community aspect, the incredible achievements, the roller coaster ride, to me, went unnoticed because I was young enough to bolster it. And as I entered into my 30s, these ambitions didn't really necessarily go away. And I set myself bigger and bigger goals. And I think a huge part of that was that it brought me from London and then to New York and then into Silicon Valley, where when I landed, I knew nobody, absolutely nobody. I very quickly noticed that I was definitely in a man's world on top of it. And this is really interesting. We all have these protective mechanisms of how we cope when we are at our limit. Mine was just to push harder and to pretend everything was just fine. And I had this beautiful facade of just keeping a smiley face and leaning in more. The more it hurt or the harder I noticed my body was pushing back, the more I leaned in. I think this is really the hardest thing about burnout is often we are in a position that we had always dreamt of being in. I had my dream job. I was in this place called Silicon Valley. I had, quote unquote, achieved all these things I'd really wanted for a long, long time. Meanwhile, my body was pushing back so hard. And I remember walking, whether it was out in Palo Alto, whether it was in San Francisco, just tears running down my eyes, having real panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And doctors in America love to just give you medication, which was wonderful because I could just take a pill and it would just temporarily all go away until it sort of came back. But I think the hardest thing was to make sense of, hang on a minute, I have everything I've always wanted. I've worked so hard to get here. And another part of me needs me to leave and needs me to just exit all of this because something is fundamentally not right. Like, it's not right that I need to take pills to live this lifestyle. It's not right that I feel so torn, that I'm sleeping so terribly. And it was incredibly humbling. At some point, my mom got cancer. And that to me was the excuse or the ability to say, you know what, I need to actually go take care of her. Somehow that gave me the excuse that I needed to just leave. I packed my bag, I went back to Germany, and I didn't realize I was leaving my job back then, but it was then a very slow, sure road to healing. And it was incredibly humbling and incredibly scary because I had left everything I always wanted and I had no idea where it was going. All I knew that whatever had happened wasn't working. It took me a good year and a half, if not 2, technically 3, depending on how you see it, to sort of crawl out of the ashes, right? I think there's sort of this beautiful image of the phoenix rising, and in the spiritual world, it's sort of your darkest moment of the soul. To kind of put yourself back together, it's sort of like everything, the house gets burnt down, and you kind of have to start from the ground up to go, who am I? Like, what is it? For me, burnout means it really burns out a lot of belief systems and thoughts that I held about myself, of who I was and what I needed to do on planet Earth to be lovable and to be worthy and to be recognized. And while it was, I think, the hardest thing I've ever gone through, now looking back, I'm so incredibly grateful to this burnout because ultimately I think I had to do a huge adjustment in where I was heading with my life. And I can now say my life feels 100% like me. I love my life. I'm deeply fulfilled by what I do. I work at a very different pace. I have an incredible family. And every day I'm just like, wow, this is so gorgeous. And I would have not ended up here if I had not gone through this burnout that really burns out a lot of these notions that I held about myself and what I needed to do here.
I really resonate with your story on 3 different levels. You mentioned your childhood came with its own traumas and its own narratives. My parents early on started telling me, that I was clever and I had a good perspective and that I could do anything I put my mind to, and I was naive enough to believe them. And I came out of that with a real sense of responsibility that I had to do something special, right? You put a lot of pressure on yourself that people are watching or people are expecting. And it was never in a sense of like, you must succeed, you must get A's. It was more like just, wow, you're special and you're going to be able to do whatever you want. And that translated to a lot of responsibility and pressure. And then you mentioned this passion for startups and how it feels like you're in love. I often used to say, it's not enough for me to be part of something, but it has to be part of me. It has to be in my DNA. I have to basically fall in love with it. And for 3/4 of my career, if I wasn't almost, I love the way you frame it, in love, there was no point for me to do it. I was only doing things I was in love with. And you mentioned the doctors giving you pills. I actually had to get on anti-anxiety pills to go to Silicon Valley. I grew up with panic attacks and anxiety. And so at a certain point, I decided I'm going to take these pills. And they were some of the ways I think I was able to commit to the move and commit to the trip on my own. So it resonates with me and probably resonates with a lot of the audience. I'm curious what made you get into this kind of work specifically, this coaching and this mental health space. Was it just having your own experience in that space, or was it something broader and deeper than that?
Yeah, I think I was asking myself that question in the last couple of days. And as I mentioned earlier, the journey starts quite early. So I think already in my early 20s, I noticed there's just certain things that were weird. I just didn't feel super grounded in my body. I noticed I had real boundary issues. I couldn't have told you, hey, I have boundary issues back then, but I noticed I just felt weird in the world. That's all I can say. And that clearly was childhood trauma. And so I think that set me off on a very early path to explore my own reality, consciousness. So I did Landmark Forum when I was 24, and then I did a lot of work with Joe Dispenza back then when I was 26. I started drinking plant medicines, I did meditation retreats, and I really started chipping away at what actually happens in our minds and hearts. What wires us, and how do we deal with a lot of things that we might not even know are there or that we don't have words for? And that exploration was, while I had my career, which sort of went one way, I just had I would say, a very deep spiritual journey that really informed me. And I read a ton of books and I really did a lot of different courses. And I think that know thyself, as Socrates said so correctly, this really understanding of ourselves and who we are. And that is not just the intellect. I think in Silicon Valley, the intellect is so put on this pedestal and the mind is all that matters. And then as you age, I think you realize, hang on a minute, there's loads of other bits of ourselves, like our body and our heart, the heart space and our soul, maybe, if you want to call it that, that inform who I am to such a huge degree. And that also bring so many amazing things, right? Our intellect can bring our career and it can bring success and maybe money. But let's be honest, pleasure, orgasms, hugs, the feeling of a delicious meal, that's all physical sensations, physical pleasures. Those are the somatic things that bring a sense of fulfillment in our life. And so that journey for me to understand that it's a lot of energy work also, and really understanding that I'm made up of a lot more than just my mind, really led me into this coaching work. And I was very lucky when I had just joined Google. I got very quickly, within 6 months, a promotion. My team suddenly was huge. And my boss back then said, apart from doing a sort of manager course, why don't you do a coaching course? And that was really the best gift somebody could have given me, because I think back then I thought, okay, being a manager is telling people what to do. And I was definitely proven wrong about that. And I'm glad I did that coaching course, because it was more like, how do I help other people grow, and how do I mirror things and help people really understand themselves in their job and how to do their best job. That was 2013 when I did that course. And it's really informed so many things in my life, including now also being a mother of 2 young children, and realizing that this parenting role is very similar also to being a leader, where it's really leading by example and also leading with a lot of heart and with a lot of vulnerability and admitting when I was wrong and repairing. And in many ways, leaders in my books should also embody these values. And I say the word embody on purpose because it's not an intellectual pursuit. You really embody these qualities. And then I think people just can trust you. And to me, that's why this coaching is so important, is we currently lacking real embodied leadership, whether that's in the presidents of the world or the leaders of huge companies. Having more sincere, heart-opened leadership, I think, is what is so tremendously needed for us to make this huge pivot on planet Earth so that we maintain an ecosystem here that we humans all can thrive in.
One thing we've kind of touched on, both with your personal story, and I think it also came through very clearly in our previous episode with Mike Filbey, there's data that suggests that founders and maybe high achievers more generally do experience more than their fair share of mental health challenges, and especially around burnout. Why do you think that is?
How on earth can we believe that founders go through the pressure cooker that startup founding is without burning out? Like, I would be impressed, because the amount of fear, uncertainty, pressure, the incentive structures from the VCs, the levels of responsibility, levels of imposter syndrome because they've never done it. Not all of us are meant to be doing this. It's really, really intense. And if you look at other people who maybe do similarly slightly bonkers things, let's say astronauts or Olympian athletes, they all have a huge team of people around them, anywhere between like 5 and 20 people who look after their health, their mental health, who make sure they're really understood their stretching and their relaxation and how they sleep and their diet. All these things are factored in and they have the best support to get them into the state to do that. And I think this is what we currently just think a person, a human in their early 20s or in their 30s can just go onto this journey by themselves and not burn out. And I think that to me is the fallacy. It's truly a fallacy. And we're setting up huge amount of people not only to fail, but the mental health crisis that comes with it is intense. And if there's families or their own family involved, then it truly has a huge ripple effect and a tremendous negative effect on the families of these founders.
We talked about the sort of achievement culture, right? This sense, often from childhood, that if somebody gets validated for achievement, it becomes this hunger that cannot be satisfied. It's nearly like a video game, right? You achieve a certain level, you get rewarded for that, and then you are off to achieve at the next level and the next one and the next one and the next one. And that goes right through school, right through university, right through your career in corporate settings. You get your next promotion, your next pay rise, all of that. And at a certain point, the validation becomes nearly like an addiction, right? You get addicted to that next level of validation. And the interesting thing that I think you've brought to this that hadn't occurred to me before is the role of the body in this, right? Which is while you're young, every time you kind of level up the achievement that's necessary in order to get that next hit of validation, your body can rise to that occasion. But eventually you've reached a height and there is no height that is high enough. Your body can no longer come along for the journey. And that's maybe where the burnout starts to come in, where you're like, oh, okay, the emptiness is still in me, but my ability to ignore it by chasing the next level of achievement is no longer physically possible. And that's when the burnout catches up with you. Does that resonate?
It absolutely resonates. Let's just briefly put our finger on this whole word of trauma, right? Trauma is a very healthy response. It's a protective mechanism of one's own system, right? So let's say a parent screams at the child. In that moment, that level of emotion to the child might be too much. So what does the child do? It quote unquote disconnects. So this also happens in rape. People leave their body very briefly. They disconnect from their physical experience because the physical experience might be overwhelming. And most people have a level of trauma, which means we are all very disconnected from our own bodies. We sometimes notice it when there's like the third cup of coffee and maybe we feel some heart palpitation, maybe no, maybe we're like, oh, well, you just deal with it and we start talking faster, etc. But that disconnection in childhood through levels of trauma means that we are not very sensitive anymore. We can't feel things as sensitively as we should. So therefore, the input from outside, the success, the money, the excitement, the input that we get to feel more needs to sort of level up. But that disconnection to the body, I think, is first and foremost, because if we all talk about it and we go, isn't it bananas? Our mindset and how we think about ourselves, where we place our value, our own self-value into these companies, into our own company, into the teams, whatever we do is greater than our own sense of well-being. And we ride ourselves into the absolute ground. And if we just really think about that, it is nearly a sign of madness that there's something wrong in the system, that we all place our own self-worth and value into these companies and into the evaluations and into the monetary side of things and totally neglect our bodies. And I think it's a societal thing. I think on planet Earth, there's so many systemic issues around where we place value, whether that is consumerism, having more, doing more instead of being more. We are human beings. And I think this is where I hope in the next years this is going to be rectified. But I can only speak personally that those 2-3 years after this burnout were really a journey into my somatic experience. So I started doing yoga and I started doing yoga nidra. You can look up Andrew Huberman, yoga nidra, things where we can learn to calm our own nervous system down. And I truly believe in this world that is so run by dopamine hits. Those that know how to calm their nervous system and regulate their nervous system are going to be the real winners of the next 10 years, because I think we can all agree that feeling stressed or anxious is such a normal state at this day and age.
Georgia, I'm wondering, you said it's a combination of education system and the consumerism. And we also said, as a founder, how can you not be stressed out, right? It's VCs and expectations and customers and employees and culture. And I think those two things are absolutely true. It's kind of baked in to the society and to the situation you're in as a founder. What I'm wondering is there some correlation between people who believe they can change the world, or that the world needs to be changed and they're the ones that can do it, and being susceptible to this endless feeling of lack or a lack of fulfillment, a feeling that you're not good enough or things aren't good enough. Is there a correlation between that chip on your shoulder and this propensity to push yourself too far and then to be despondent when things aren't going well enough?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. There's a saying, I think a chip on your shoulder will bring you chips in your pocket. What is a chip on the shoulder? At the end of the day, the need to prove yourself again comes from some sort of childhood trauma, right? And there's also a saying along the lines of we can keep chasing the person that we think we are, or we are able to befriend the person that we truly are. And I think only when we truly befriend that person can we experience a sense of peace within and a sense of fulfillment and a sort of very calm, steady sense of happiness. This is where everybody has to choose. I think Elon Musk will always go after building that next company. That is just who he is. I don't think he's interested in inner peace. Not in this lifetime, maybe. There's a sort of level of energy that each of us holds when we come here to this planet. I think this is where it gets a bit spiritual, whether it's your karma or whether it's your mission. And some people need to go through it. Like if you'd have told me at age 30, Georgia, don't go to Silicon Valley. You're going to just burn out. It's going to be too intense. Like, what are you doing? You should get married. I'm just like, get away. No way. I'm going.
Even as you say this now, falling in love and befriending the person you are, I'm hearing, as someone who fancies themselves an entrepreneur, as a founder, a change maker, I'm hearing settle and it's okay to be mediocre. And my wife and I are trying to decide where to live, and we're talking about almost retiring to Southeast Asia or going to New York and getting back into the thick of it. And my wife said to me, you will kill yourself in Southeast Asia. You will go crazy. You'll go mad trying to befriend yourself, essentially trying to settle into the moment. You'll be bored within a month. Is that just who I am naturally, or is that childhood trauma that is yelling in my ear? How do you know?
That is the $1,000,000 question, right? Such a delicate, multifaceted process to explore, right? And I wish I could tell you the answer right now. I think we would have to dive a lot deeper and do quite a bit of coaching to find out.
This whole episode is an excuse for me to get free therapy, actually. So,
This is this quote, know thyself. Find out that. And maybe one way to find out is to go to New York and see how it goes, right? There is no great way to do this life, I think. To me, this burnout was an incredible rectification to bring me back into a path that feels now a lot more like me, where I can do good. For me, it was all impact oriented. I wanted to impact the world. I wanted to make a great impact. I impact in my way now. It's different. I'm not impacting billion people. At Google X, it was always, can we impact the lives of 1 billion people? I'm not doing that anymore, but I can impact the people that I'm working with. And that feels like a really good, attainable, wholesome goal for me now. And I'm not saying anybody needs to stop their mission, needs to stop anything. And this is where it goes to sort of like, what proactively can we even do to not burn out? I think there are sort of the basic things like having good sleep hygiene and diet and exercise and all this sort of basic stuff. But then it is really working with either a therapist or a coach to better understand your own psyche, because the psyche is a very complex place. And for each of us, it's fundamentally different depending on what we've experienced and what we've come here with. But the better we understand our own strengths and weaknesses and triggers as to when do we lean in, when do we feel unworthy, when do we want to prove ourselves, and to just question those parts within us. We call this parts work. Really questioning those parts and getting to know those parts, because often these parts within us that have maybe pushed really hard or that are feeling unworthy are parts that we've pushed away and we've pushed them under the carpet because they're not very nice parts or don't feel very lovable. And just the mere fact of taking them out from under the carpet, having a conversation with them, getting to know thyself can already alleviate a lot of that dichotomy and a lot of conflict that we carry within ourselves between a part that wants to sleep and take care of ourselves and another part that is pushing us relentlessly to prove ourselves in the world.
It's an uncomfortable place we've taken this conversation in a way, right? Because that's exactly what Chris was saying. We're talking in a sense about motivation. You used that phrase, chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets. And in a sense, if you want to work on yourself, if you want to massage that chip out of your shoulder, then in a way that could take away some of that driving force that causes you to have impact. And so I suppose the question is, if you're talking at founders, and not just founders, I think anybody who is, I guess you'd say, career oriented and achievement oriented, What are the healthy sources of motivation as opposed to these less healthy sources that ultimately lead to burnout and unhappiness and anxiety along the way?
You've summarized the whole thing very well. And I think this is a really beautiful question. I would like to caveat or just mention, I think there's loads and loads of people out there who are very successful, but it's not coming from a place of trauma, where they have decades, multiple decade long careers because they're able to actually look after themselves and because they're not doing the 5-year sprint and pushing themselves to the max. Of course, they need to push. Of course, I will not deny that it takes a level of pushing and sacrifice to make a startup work. I am not the one saying that you can just do your 9 to 5 and think you can build a startup. Not at all. I see it, I understand it, and it's something that I think will potentially need to change. I think it has, again, something to do with incentivization structures. The venture model and venture capital is just something where they push to get their returns within 5 to 10 years. Therefore, the pressure comes. I now coach at least 3 or 4 companies that are bootstrapped, where I'm not saying the pressure is a lot less, but it definitely feels that the freedom they have to navigate the businesses that they own 100% outright is a very different one than where they have shareholders in their cap table. And so, having said that, I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I think it really is founder to founder specific. I think just having these conversations, raising awareness around it, and for an individual, let's say they're noticing that things are going south, to reach out for help, whether it's through a friend, coach, a therapist, a family member, to open up and be able to voice what's going on for them is really the first step.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
So, Georgia, maybe let's get really tactical now, right? Really pragmatic and practical to help those listening to think through this in their own lives in terms of actionable steps. And so, perhaps the place to start here is, what are the early signs that something's going wrong? That there's this misalignment between your mental state of I need to change the world and your body, as you talked about, the embodiment of what's actually going on for you. What are some early signs to listen for, to feel for, where you might need to be careful and need to seek some help or some balance in your life?
I think for many, it sort of comes very different. But I think when we start noticing that we're breaking our own word repetitively, like we sort of go, okay, as of Monday, I'm going to stop smoking, or I'm going to stop drinking coffee, or I'm going to start including a bit of a walk every morning. When we notice that we are going, you know what, I'm going to sleep when I've done the next raise, or I'm going to start exercising once the money is in, or when we've reached 500,000 users, then I'm going to start doing XYZ. Or I will start seeing friends when XYZ. So when we start making very basic needs dependent on sort of external factors in our mind, there's these sort of funny games that start happening. Usually these are very basic needs. Yeah, it's exercise, it's sleep, it's seeing friends, it's doing a weekend away to have some time off. These are often things that happen in our own minds. These are the little games we play with ourselves. It's like, hey, if you push a little bit harder, then you'll get a bit of a reward over there. When these games start going on for too long, we know that we are already in funky territory, because then we are really moving out of integrity. We're lying and sort of betraying ourselves in a way. And I think that's the first sign of going, okay, I maybe can't be going away for the weekend, but let's commit to something that I can commit to, and then let's follow through.
That's a very particular kind of breaking your word, where all the examples you gave, you are connecting your self-care needs to company goals and then breaking your word about taking care of yourself when you achieve a company goal. And I think even connecting your basic self-care to company goals in the first place is probably a problematic situation to be in, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I mean, I have founders who are way down the line, 5, 6 year companies, and the founders still feel guilty to go and exercise because they feel the hour that they spend at the gym should rather be spent in the company, right? This is somebody who's already got a very successful Series B company. And so I only highlight this because it's a slippery slope. We don't notice when we start making these weird little pacts with ourselves. These are little mental games that we play, trying to make us feel better about the fact that we're not looking after ourselves. It's hard to sometimes know what is normal And there is no normal. Mental health is nothing. There's nothing normal in mental health because we are all on a spectrum of maybe a bit more neurotic, maybe a little bit more ADHD. We all have sort of slight neuroses in our own psyche. And the question is just becoming aware of them and going, oh, because nobody from the outside knows what's going on in your head. I'm one of the very few people who's been given privilege to jump into people's heads and to really, through conversation, understand what is happening in their minds. And what I get to hear is I have to sometimes smile. And I'm like, did he or she just realize what she just said? You know, they sort of talk to me as if it's totally normal. And I'm like, let's double click on what you've just said there and expand and see whether this makes sense.
You mentioned having children before, and all three of us on this podcast have young children. And as a founder myself, I've found the analogy between parenting and running a startup to be quite rich. No analogy is perfect, but I think there's so much there. And you often see a situation where parents sacrifice their own happiness for their children, right? They will do anything for their child and they don't do anything for themselves. And they think that this type of self-sacrifice is what good parenting is. But actually, that's not healthy for children. Children want to see parents who have joy in their lives, who have balance in their own lives, who put their own needs in the same ballpark as their child's needs, and that is actually part of what it takes to raise a healthy child. And also the aspect of, as a child gets older, you need to give it more space. You need to let go progressively, right? You need to start to disentangle your identity from the identity of your children. And I think both these things are things that I see parents get wrong, but I see founders get wrong much more often, right? Which is to say, okay, I am going to meld my identity with that of my startup, and I am going to sacrifice my own needs to the needs of my startup because I think that will be good for the company. But actually, not only is it bad for you, ultimately it creates a fragility in the startup that I believe is bad for business too.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful analogy and such a potent, important message out there. The image that comes to mind is when you sit in the airplane and the oxygen mask drops, put it on yourself first before you put it onto your children and the people around you. And I think this is the same analogy is ultimately anybody who's regularly done exercise, who's eaten well and who's slept well understands that the mental capacity to deal with problems and to problem solve, to have clear thinking, to make good decisions, etc., comes from that place. And it's incredible. You're like, wow, I really feel like I'm working up my optimal. We all know, especially as parents, when you've had a few nights of lack of sleep, what happens? Yeah, I mean, it's like torture, where suddenly all decision making goes out of the window and we become emotional mess. And so I think truly these basic self-care needs of exercise, diet, sleep, friends in your life make you a better CEO. And I think that's really hard to understand. But similar to what you've, drew that analogy to parenting, I 100% agree. I think as parents, we also need to show very clear boundaries and need to check in with ourselves. How are we doing? I'm very fortunate to have an incredible husband and partner to do this with, where sometimes at the end of the evening, I'm just like, you know what? I need a timeout. I actually need a bit of just time away. And we do that to each other because we know that the other person is sort of maybe at a breaking point or just has a short fuse. And just having that is such a luxury to have a co-parent to do this with. And I think that's a similar thing in startups, having a good co-founder or a great board where you can also lean on in times that are tricky and just sort of, I actually just need an evening off. Maybe it's a day off over the weekend to just get back to myself is something that I can highly recommend if it is possible. I know it's not possible for everybody.
Yeah, it's such a great metaphor. I'm learning this myself with my new son. And I think it works on two levels. Number one is it's modeling good behavior and self-care for your kids, or by extension for your team. But it's also, as you say, Georgia, putting the oxygen mask on yourself so that you can be a good, intentional parent when you are engaging with your kids. Because if you are constantly frazzled and burned out and regretting your life choices, even the time you spend with your kids is going to be poor quality and it's going to be biting or sharp or impatient or what have you. And so on both levels, it's good for your team to model this behavior so they can do their best and to be able to show up as an intentional leader, a high quality intentional leader for your team if you yourself are rested and doing some amount of self-care.
I think this is where rituals or routines come in, right? So for me and my husband, Sunday afternoons are ours. We are fortunate enough to be in a position to have a nanny from time to time. And so Sunday afternoons, we have real one-on-one time. This is time for us to connect, to be intimate, to share, to talk, to have fun. And I sort of recommend that to founders who are in relationship to really have a time with your partner to drop in and really have that connection time. Because I've also had founders where they're going suddenly through divorce on top of dealing with a startup, which is double intense. So to nurture important relationships, and it's the same thing between co-founders, to really have maybe Friday afternoon, an hour and a half where you go for a walk together or where you connect that is not in the office, to also catch up as friends or as people that work together, but more on an emotional basis. And we call this a check-in, basically. It's just one person talking about how their week was, what's going on for them, what's driving them crazy, what's making them happy, what are they grateful for, just so that they have a place to actually go a bit over and beyond just the day-to-day madness of managing a family or madness of managing a startup.
Yeah, that's another way that the family analogy really applies to startups, where your employees are your kids, the startup is your kid, and your co-founder is your life partner in a sense. So we talked about these mind games that you play with your self-care, tying them to corporate goals, and that's oftentimes the first signs you're doing something that will lead to burnout. Georgia, what are some of the other mindset traps that founders are falling into that is contributing to this lack of mental health and burnout?
I think the minute sort of sleep, diet, exercise goes out of the window, you already have a problem, right? We all fall off that wagon. Yeah. We all like maybe start eating pizza for a while or we don't do the exercise. The problem is not falling off the wagon. It's how long it takes you to get back on the wagon. Okay, fine. You just had 2 weeks of, debauchery. When can you commit to doing exercise again and eating healthy? So that there's really this, how quickly do we get back on? I think if we're talking about mindset, it has a lot to do with your personal boundaries and where you place your self-worth, right? And this is truly why ultimately working with a coach or working with somebody who can help you understand what your individual traps are so that you create awareness. Ultimately, what we need to do is create awareness around these triggers and these traps and these ways where we fall in a quasi hole with ourselves. Often it's really hard for us to see that ourselves because we're like a fish in water. We're swimming in our own mental soup every day. We don't know how it could be different. And this is where the work with a therapist or coach comes in to reflect back and for you to gain better awareness of your own mental construct.
So, are there specific examples of like types of mindset traps? You work with a lot of individual founders, CEOs. I think those are your two specialties. Like, are there things that you see, patterns of thought or behavior that you actually see over and over again, things people should watch out for?
I mean, I think imposter syndrome, but it's kind of a hard not to have imposter syndrome when you're starting a company because you're doing a ton of new stuff all the time, right? And you're constantly learning and growing. I think there's a lot around perfectionism, right? And what is perfect and how perfect can a product be? Perfectionism is really a slippery slope. There's a hero complex of needing to rescue the world, save the world, create things that will hugely impact the world. All of these sort of point towards what we call the drama triangle or the Kaplan triangle, where we have a victim, we have a prosecutor, and we have a rescuer. And we all like to play one of these roles. And depending where we are, we might be like, oh, I'm feeling terrible. It's been so stressful. And we kind of go into victim mentality during the day. And then in the evening, the hero comes and says, okay, fine, we'll have 2 glasses of wine. It's going to make you feel better. The prosecutor shames us and makes us feel wrong. And you haven't worked enough. It's only 8 o'clock in the evening. I bet everybody else in Silicon Valley is working till 11 o'clock. Like, put in the hours. Otherwise, you're not going to get that kind of voice, right? And it's not a very healthy way to live. These voices being on this drama triangle creates a lot of conflict and a lot of issues within us. I would say one of the main key things I see in founders is really a lack of self-worth, especially when I speak to very successful founders, really being privy to how deep some of this lack of self-worth runs. It really personally affects me in the sense that my heart goes out because I realize, again, from the outside, they look like they have everything. They have a fantastic company. They have lots of success. And yet that sense of self-worth hasn't changed since day number one. And it's where all of this becomes really a very personal journey into creating self-worth and establishing sense of self-worth and boundaries. And that is a process. I wish I could say that is only a few coaching sessions, but that really takes a bit of time.
Mike Filbey shared a concern about his self-worth. We asked him what he had done to work on his problems, and he said, actually, I've done less than I should because in some ways I didn't believe that I deserved to be helped and worked on. That was, I think, one of the most honest and brave parts of the interview where he admitted that. And it's interesting to hear that that's a common thing. It's also interesting, I think, there are some subset of founders who go into building their own company ostensibly because they just don't want a boss. They're like, oh, I thought I just want to go work for myself because it feels like an easier, better path for them and it's less responsibility or something. And it's so clear that being a founder, at least a founder with any sense of obligation, responsibility, ambition, startups are the furthest thing from easier. And not having a boss is not a luxury. It is actually an enormous amount of pressure that you place upon yourself. And I think some founders who get in this for that reason are sorely missing the point and will be sorely disappointed, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The multiple reasons why people get into this game, I think definitely over the last 20 years, it has also been hyped as the thing to do. Like, if you don't start a company, then like, what are you doing with your life? And I think also in that podcast, I share so much with what he said around not really wanting my children to start companies. Yeah, I went through, I have a father who's a founder, I have a husband who was a founder. I think he also himself had to go through that humbling period of realizing the impact of him continuously working and what that had on us as a family, right? And how it destroys family. And it really is not talked enough about. It is always only talked about how Instagram 3 founders made X amount of billions and sort of how simple and easy that was. And I think that's such a fallacy. And I'm grateful there's more voices coming out about the real pitfalls and the downsides and the extraordinary difficulties that the founder's journeys can have on your psychological, mental health, as well as maybe your families and friends and so forth.
So, media that's hyping up startups. So, basically, you're saying we're part of the problem, Georgia. Is that what you're saying?
Well, part of the problem, part of the solution. I truly believe entrepreneurship can be done in a wholesome way. I think there are examples of it. I don't think these are the examples that are being hailed around the world because often these are companies that get built over 20 or 30 years and not over 5.
Chris was obviously joking a little bit, I hope, Chris. But yeah, I think there is actually a point here, which is with our podcast, one of the things we see is, like you say, Georgia, this sort of founder life and entrepreneurship has been hyped a lot. And we find a lot of people who come into the game of, let's say, venture-backed startups without knowing the unwritten rules of the game. And so, one of our unofficial taglines is that we help explain the unwritten rules. And I think the toll it takes on you, what you need to be willing to go through, what you need to do to look after yourself, that is part of the unwritten rules. And so that's why we see our episodes on mental health as being super important, because we hear from our listeners, this is something I struggle with. And they often don't even know why. You mentioned the imposter syndrome and so on. They don't know why they're struggling with it, and they don't realize that other people struggle as well. Something amazing I heard this week, actually, is that there was an interview with the founder of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang. So NVIDIA is the chip company that powers all of AI. I think it's $1 trillion company, or at least it was recently. And he was asked, what would he do differently if he had to do it all over again? And he said, I wouldn't have started NVIDIA because I don't think it's been worth the personal cost. And, this is somebody who's founded one of the most successful companies of the last few decades, or of all time in some ways. And this is his reflection. So this is definitely not for everyone. And it definitely takes a toll. Again, like parenting. Life's definitely easier if you don't have kids, and life's definitely easier if you don't have a startup. It can be incredibly rewarding, but understand the cost that it exacts from you. And then, and this is why we're talking to you, Georgia, learn how to look after yourself, so you can do this in the long term, and so that you can look back on it and say, I'm glad I did that, not I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of a movie called The Comedian, which is a bio documentary on Jerry Seinfeld, following him around as he's rebuilding his set from scratch. He threw away all his material. And in the last few moments of the whole documentary about how successful he's been and how incredible he is and how he's at the top of his craft and there's nobody been like him before, the interviewer is like, so what do you want to do next? Why do you keep working so hard? And he kind of just looks out at the middle distance and he just goes, I just want to do something important and feel like I've made an impact. It's just like Jerry Seinfeld, who's had the most successful situational comedy in the history of the world. He was at the top of his game, has made the most money in his field ever. even he feels unsatisfied, unfulfilled, and like he is not yet a success. And I know there are some other founders who are very successful, who have created household name companies, who are still out there hustling to try to prove that it wasn't a fluke, to prove that they could do it again. And we've mentioned another founder, an investor who's been incredibly off the chart successful, who's escaped to the bush to meet shamans to try to find what does this all mean? Because he's got all the money and he's still not happy. And so as we touched on in the last episode about this emptiness and this need to prove yourself is not going to be fulfilled by your startup. That's something you need to work on with a coach and with a psychologist and on yourself and being present, because that's not the path to filling that hole.
The chip on your shoulder puts chips in your pocket, but it never actually cures you of the chip on your shoulder. Georgia, if somebody is listening to this, and no doubt there are people listening to this who are struggling with feelings of burnout or other related issues, who are listening to this episode and nodding along, but also maybe feeling a little bit uncertain what to do about it, a little bit helpless, what would you advise them to do?
I think it goes back to these very basic tools, like really having good sleep hygiene, eating well, and trying to exercise. That's sort of the thing that every founder can try and improve on, as hard as it might be in the circumstances that they're facing. And I'm aware that sleeping 8 hours might not seem like an option for many founders. And then I do believe the issue that gets created of going into burnout comes from a particular mindset that we have. And changing one's own mindset is at times possible, but having somebody help makes it a lot easier, because it's really, as I mentioned, really hard for us to even notice the water that we're swimming in. And so seeing whether somebody in the startup community knows a startup coach or whether there's a good therapist. The great thing is we live in times now, which I think 20 years ago just didn't exist, where through Zoom, you can, through not a huge amount of money, find people to support you in this journey. And I think the stigma also around having a coach or having a therapist has dropped significantly. It's no longer a weird thing or there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It's actually, I think, more and more becoming a fantastic tool for founders to have in their tool set to rely on in times that are challenging. So I can only hope that this gives founders the courage or the impetus to reach out and find themselves a coach. Ideally, not when things are really, really, really bad already, but if you already notice that things are going downhill, reach out earlier than later so that you have somebody in place in case it gets worse.
And I would say that last point is so, so important, right, Georgia, which is I think founders need to think about investing in themselves in the same way that they would invest in their startup. And if it helps you to think about it this way, you are the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. You are at least as important as the capital, as the features of your product, as your go-to-market strategy. You are at least as important as those other resources and facets of your business. And so while you're spending endless amount of energy and time working on those things, you as the pivotal resource for your startup deserve that kind of investment as well. And so, as you said, before you start having symptoms of burnout, before it's too late, you need to be in maintenance mode on this incredibly important resource. And that way, maybe it takes it out of the realm of, do I deserve or have self-worth to work on myself? Or do I have an imposter syndrome? Or do I have the time to do this? At least you are in the foxhole with your startup and you are a resource for your startup. And maybe that will make it more digestible, more relatable to some of those founders who can't find the impetus to prioritize themselves.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely.
Georgia, thanks so much for your time today. It's really been a very valuable conversation. I'm sure our listeners will agree. If people do want to think about working with you as a coach, or if they're just keen on following you online, where can they find you and how can they get in touch?
So I'm a coach at the Moshari Method. If you look up the Moshari Method, it is also a fantastic online resource. It's about, I think, 88 Google documents with the most proven tools and sort of tactics on how to run your business. Everything from how to give feedback, to do one-on-ones, how to have hard conversations or deal with co-founder conflicts. Really a fantastic free online resource, which you can find under the Moshari Method. We as coaches are not solely focused on burnout or mental health at all. We really help fast scaling companies, really getting the right processes in place, really building systems around them so that these companies can be the sort of rocket ships that they are, while we also obviously make sure that we deal with any other more emotional or mental issues that come up for the founders. And alternatively, I have a website, which is just my name, georgiadienst.com, or LinkedIn or Twitter, all under my name.
And of course, we'll have all of those links and references in the show notes so people will be able to go look down there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, Georgia. Thank you very much for your own vulnerability on the subject and sharing your insights and experience working with so many founders. It's really been fantastic. Thank you.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Insil. Most paid marketing campaigns have a negative ROI. Don't let that be you. Insil brings big brand expertise to small businesses across Australia and pride themselves on their no BS approach to driving traffic, leads, and sales for your business. They're award-winning, but more impressive in my view is the 4.8-star rating that they've earned on Google. Read the reviews, then jump onto insil.com.au and ask them how they can help you. Tell them we sent you.